Menendez brothers' story, abuse, murder, and media frenzy. You're tuned in to 22 Crime, where the truth hides in the details. Together we dive into the darkest corners of human nature, exploring the mysteries that have left investigators puzzled and families searching for justice. Because in the world of crime, the truth is never as simple as it seems. The clock is ticking. Let's uncover the truth behind today's mystery. Viewer discretion is advised. 22 is a true crime podcast that delves into real-life crime stories, which often involve graphic descriptions, sensitive content, and strong language that may not be suitable for all audiences. We strive to present these cases with the utmost respect for the victims and their families. Please note that the content discussed may be distressing or triggering for some listeners. Additionally, all resources and information presented in this podcast are obtained from publicly available internet sources. Listener discretion is strongly advised, and we recommend that only mature audiences proceed with caution. If you are sensitive to such content, please consider watching another video. Stay safe and take care of your mental health. Welcome to a journey unlike any other, a descent into the twisted, haunting corridors of true crime, where the lines between victim and villain blur, and the truth is far more disturbing than fiction. Today, we peel back the layers of one of the most chilling and controversial cases in modern American history. Prepare yourself for a tale of opulence overshadowed by darkness, a story where the facade of a perfect family shatters into a million irreparable pieces. This is the story of Lyle and Erik Menendez, brothers whose names have become synonymous with cold-blooded parricide, a crime that stunned the world and continues to ignite debate more than 30 years later. In the sun-soaked, palm-lined streets of Beverly Hills, where the wealthy retreat behind gilded gates and manicured lawns, a nightmare was born. On the surface, the Menendez family epitomized the American dream, wealthy, influential, and seemingly untouchable. But beneath that veneer of luxury lurked a dark undercurrent of control, fear, and secrets. On the night of August 20th, 1989, that carefully maintained facade was ripped apart when Jose Menendez, a self-made titan of industry, and his wife, Kitty, were brutally murdered in their home. The world would soon discover that the assassins weren't shadowy figures from a distant underworld, but their own sons, Lyle and Erik. As the investigation unfolded and the brothers were arrested, the world collectively gasped. How could these two young men, who seemed to have everything, turn into such cold-blooded murderers? Were they truly driven by greed, or were they the final tragic victims of a lifetime of hidden torment? Today, we'll dive deep into this case, unraveling a tale of power, privilege, and the dark secrets that festered behind closed doors. We'll explore the complexities of the Menendez family dynamic, the chilling events leading up to that fateful night, and the media circus that turned a family tragedy into a nationwide spectacle. By the end of this episode, we'll confront the questions that have lingered for decades. Were Lyle and Erik Menendez born to kill, or were they pushed to the edge by forces beyond their control? As we delve into the murky waters of this infamous case, prepare to question everything you thought you knew about family, power, and the true meaning of justice. Imagine living in the lap of luxury, surrounded by every comfort money can buy. Your home is a sprawling mansion in Beverly Hills, your family the picture of success. But what if behind the grand facade, the truth was far darker than anyone could ever suspect? This was the world of Lyle and Erik Menendez, a world that would soon explode into a media frenzy when they were accused of the unthinkable, murdering their own parents in cold blood. The Menendez brothers' case is more than just a tale of murder. It's a story of power, fear, and the devastating consequences of secrets kept too long. On that warm August night in 1989, Jose and Kitty Menendez were gunned down in their home in what initially appeared to be a mafia-style execution. But as investigators dug deeper, they uncovered a web of lies, deceit, and a motive far more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. The evidence led straight to their sons, who soon confessed to the crime. But the real question is why? What could drive two young men, seemingly living the dream, to commit such a violent and final act? Was it simply greed, or were there darker, more twisted motives at play? We'll dissect every aspect of this case, from the psychological makeup of the Menendez family to the sensational trials that followed and the ripple effects that continue to this day. Through expert analysis, court records, and first-hand accounts, we'll piece together the complex puzzle of the Menendez brothers' case, searching not just for what happened, but for the deeper truth of why it happened. Were they ruthless killers or tragic figures driven to the brink by unimaginable pressures? As we embark on this journey, prepare to have your perspective challenged and perhaps changed by the end. As we delve into this dark tale, we'll guide you step by step through the intricacies of the Menendez brothers' story. This episode will unfold like a mystery, with each layer revealing new horrors and deeper truths. We'll start by tracing the origins of the Menendez family, exploring the roots of the ambition and control that would eventually lead to their downfall. We'll delve into Jose Menendez's rise from an immigrant chasing the American dream to a powerful executive, and how his relentless pursuit of success shaped, and perhaps shattered, his family. Then, we'll walk you through the events of August 20th, 1989, the night the dream became a nightmare. We'll reconstruct the crime, detail the brothers' calculated actions, and examine the immediate aftermath that left a community reeling and investigators puzzled. From there, we'll enter the courtroom, where the Menendez trials became a national obsession. We'll analyze the prosecution's case, which portrayed the brothers as cold, calculating killers, and the defense's shocking allegations of long-term abuse that turned the trial into a battle not just for justice, but for the truth. Finally, we'll reflect on the legacy of this case, its impact on the legal system, the media, and public consciousness. We'll consider how the Menendez brothers became symbols of a crime that continues to fascinate and divide us long after the verdicts were handed down. So, sit back and prepare to dive into the chilling world of the Menendez brothers, a world where the line between victim and villain is as blurred as the truth itself. To unravel the tragedy that struck the Menendez family, we must first journey back to where it all began, with the man who was both the architect of their fortune and, arguably, the architect of their downfall, Jose Enrique Menendez. Born on May 6, 1944, in the vibrant yet volatile city of Havana, Cuba, Jose's early life was shaped by forces beyond his control, setting the stage for the relentless ambition that would define him. In the 1950s, Cuba was a nation teetering on the edge of revolution, a place where the tropical beauty of the land masked the simmering unrest beneath. Jose's childhood was spent in a world of stark contrasts, privilege against a backdrop of political upheaval. His father, a successful soccer player, and his mother, from a well-to-do family, provided him with a life that, on the surface, seemed comfortable. But as the winds of revolution began to blow harder, that comfort was threatened. By 1960, when Jose was just 16, the revolution that had been brewing in the streets of Havana reached its boiling point. Fidel Castro had risen to power, and the world Jose knew was falling apart. Fearing the sweeping changes that were coming, Jose and his family made a life-altering decision to flee their homeland, leaving behind everything they had ever known. They sought refuge in the United States, a land of new beginnings but also of harsh realities. Jose's arrival in America marked the beginning of his relentless quest to rebuild and reclaim what he had lost. Armed with little more than a fierce determination and a sharp intellect, he enrolled at Southern Illinois University, throwing himself into his studies with the same intensity that would later define his business career. Accounting became his ticket out of poverty, and soon, Jose's drive and ambition began to pay off. He was a man who had learned early that nothing would be handed to him, he would have to take it. After college, Jose's ascent was swift. He quickly climbed the corporate ladder, first at RCA, a powerhouse in the entertainment industry, and later at Live Entertainment, where his shrewd business acumen and unyielding drive brought him wealth and power. But with success came an iron will and a control that he exerted not just in the boardroom but at home, a control that would sow the seeds of tragedy. Jose Menendez was a man who had overcome incredible odds, who had clawed his way to the top with sheer determination. But as we'll soon see, his drive for success came at a steep price, a price paid not just by him, but by his entire family. While Jose Menendez was busy conquering the world of business, his wife, Kitty, was fighting battles of her own, battles that were less visible perhaps, but no less devastating. Born Mary Louise Anderson on October 14, 1941, in the modest suburb of Oak Lawn, Illinois, Kitty's life was, in many ways, shaped by the era she grew up in, an era when a woman's worth was often measured by her ability to be the perfect wife and mother. Kitty was beautiful, charming, and full of dreams, but like many women of her time, she found herself caught between ambition and expectation. She dreamed of a career in television, a world just beginning to explode with possibilities, but those dreams were set aside when she met Jose Menendez at Southern Illinois University. Jose's charisma and ambition were magnetic, and Kitty, drawn to his confidence and vision, made a choice that would change the course of her life. She married him. Marriage to Jose meant giving up her own aspirations to support his. Kitty became the quintessential 1960s housewife, dedicated to creating the perfect home, raising their 2 sons, and maintaining the image of the successful executive's wife. But beneath the polished exterior, Kitty struggled with her own demons. The pressure to maintain a perfect facade, combined with her husband's controlling nature, began to erode her sense of self. As Jose's career soared, so too did the family's wealth, and with it the pressure on Kitty to keep up appearances. The Menendez family's move to Beverly Hills in the 1980s, into a world of glittering opulence, should have been the fulfillment of the American dream. But for Kitty, it was a gilded cage. The isolation of wealth, the demands of high society, and her own feelings of inadequacy took a toll on her mental health. Depression crept in, and with it, an increasing reliance on alcohol and prescription drugs. Kitty's relationship with her sons, Lyle and Erik, was fraught with complexity. She loved them fiercely and wanted the best for them, but her emotional struggles often made her distant, critical, and unpredictable. The boys, who craved affection and stability, found themselves caught in the crossfire of their parents' strained relationship. The pressure to live up to their father's expectations, coupled with the emotional instability of their mother, created a volatile environment, one that would have devastating consequences. Kitty Menendez was a woman who appeared to have it all: wealth, status, and a beautiful family. But as we peel back the layers of her life, it becomes clear that she, too, was trapped in a life that was not entirely her own, a life where the pursuit of perfection masked deep, unresolved pain. To the outside world, the Menendez family was a picture of success, wealthy, powerful, and living in one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in America. But behind the closed doors of their Beverly Hills mansion, the reality was far different. It was a world where the pursuit of perfection, driven by Jose Menendez's unyielding expectations, created a pressure cooker of control, fear, and resentment. Jose was not just a father, he was a dictator in his own home. He saw his sons as extensions of himself, demanding nothing short of excellence in every aspect of their lives. Lyle, the elder of the 2, bore the brunt of these expectations. From a young age, he was pushed to excel, academically, athletically, socially. Jose's vision for Lyle was crystal clear. He would follow in his father's footsteps, achieve greatness, and carry on the Menendez legacy. But the weight of these expectations was crushing, and Lyle began to rebel in small but telling ways. Erik, the younger brother, was seen as the more sensitive and artistic of the 2. Jose's focus on Erik was different, yet no less intense. Erik showed promise as a tennis prodigy, and Jose, ever the strategist, saw this as another avenue to showcase the family's success. But even in this, the pressure to succeed was relentless. Erik, like Lyle, struggled under the weight of his father's demands, his artistic nature clashing with the rigid expectations imposed on him. Kitty's role in this dynamic was both complicated and tragic. She was expected to support Jose's ambitions for their sons, to be the perfect wife and mother, but her own emotional instability made this nearly impossible. Kitty vacillated between being nurturing and critical, loving and distant, adding to the emotional turmoil within the household. The boys, already struggling with their father's authoritarian rule, found little refuge in their mother's unpredictable behavior. The Menendez household, despite its outward appearance of success, was a pressure cooker, a place where perfection was demanded but never truly attainable. The expectations Jose placed on his sons were suffocating, leaving them feeling trapped in a life that was not of their choosing. The tension within the family simmered just below the surface, unseen by outsiders who only saw the glamorous facade. But as Lyle and Erik grew older, the cracks in that facade began to widen, leading to acts of rebellion that hinted at the storm brewing within. By the time Lyle and Erik reached their late teens, the pressure had reached a breaking point. The constant demands, the unrelenting control, and the emotional instability that marked their lives had created a toxic environment, one where the unthinkable was not only possible, but perhaps inevitable. Lyle and Erik Menendez were born into a life of privilege, a world where every opportunity was handed to them, where success was not just expected but demanded. But this privilege came with a dark side, a side that would eventually drive them to commit a crime so shocking it would stun the world. From the moment they were born, Lyle and Erik were groomed to be the heirs to their father's empire. They attended the best schools, were enrolled in countless extracurricular activities, and were given every material possession they could ever want. But beneath the surface, the expectations placed upon them were suffocating. There was no room for error, no tolerance for failure. Every aspect of their lives was meticulously controlled by Jose, who saw them not as children to be nurtured, but as projects to be perfected. Lyle, the older of the two, was the first to push back against this control. His teenage years were marked by small acts of rebellion, petty thefts, defiance against his father's rules. These were not just the typical misbehaviors of adolescence, but signs of a deeper struggle, a struggle to break free from the rigid expectations that had been imposed on him since birth. But every act of rebellion was met with harsh discipline, reinforcing the cycle of control and defiance. Erik, the more introverted and sensitive brother, found his own way to cope. Tennis became his escape, a way to carve out an identity separate from his father's suffocating influence. But even in this, the pressure to succeed was overwhelming. The constant push to be the best, to win at all costs, weighed heavily on Erik, who internalized the fear of failure and the need to live up to his father's impossible standards. As they grew older, the brothers' rebellion became more pronounced. Lyle's acts of defiance escalated, while Erik's anxiety and fear deepened. The two brothers, once close, began to drift apart, each struggling to cope with the oppressive environment in their own way. Yet, they were bound by a shared experience, a life dominated by their father's control and their mother's emotional instability. The Menendez household, with its luxurious trappings and outward appearance of perfection, was a place of deep emotional turmoil. The brothers, who were expected to embody their father's vision of success, were instead suffocating under the weight of expectations they could never meet. The pressure was building, the tension was rising, and the cracks in the family's facade were growing wider by the day. As Lyle and Erik entered their 20s, the storm that had been brewing for years finally reached its breaking point. The brothers, pushed to the edge by years of pressure, control, and emotional turmoil, would soon make a decision that would change their lives, and the lives of everyone around them, forever. It was a warm summer evening in Beverly Hills, and the streets of North Elm Drive were as serene as ever. The palm trees swayed gently in the breeze, casting long shadows over the meticulously manicured lawns of the sprawling estates that lined the street. In the Menendez mansion, a grand Mediterranean-style home that exuded both wealth and power, the family's day had been a quiet one, filled with the kind of mundane activities that seemed almost obligatory in their world of luxury. Earlier that day, Jose Menendez, the patriarch whose iron will had built an empire, had watched a James Bond movie with his family. The choice of film, The Spy Who Loved Me, was fitting, given Jose's taste for the finer things in life and his obsession with control. After the movie, the family indulged in ice cream, a simple pleasure in a life otherwise defined by extravagance. It was a moment that, to any outside observer, would seem perfectly normal. But beneath the surface, something far more sinister was brewing. As night fell, the Menendez home settled into an uneasy calm. Jose, ever the disciplinarian, retired to the family room to read, while his wife, Kitty, reclined nearby, perhaps lost in her own thoughts. Their two sons, Lyle and Erik, were supposedly out for the evening, enjoying the privileges of their youth in the City of Angels. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that can only exist in a place where every need is met, every desire fulfilled. But this quiet was deceptive. It was the calm before the storm, the moment of stillness before everything would change forever. For while Jose and Kitty Menendez relaxed in the safety of their home, their sons were on a collision course with destiny, one that would shatter the facade of their perfect lives and reveal the darkness lurking within. Lyle and Erik were not simply out for the evening. They were preparing to commit an act so brutal, so final, that it would leave their family and the world reeling. As they drove through the streets of Beverly Hills, the plan they had meticulously crafted over weeks, perhaps even months, was about to be set in motion. The plan to kill their parents had been brewing in the minds of Lyle and Erik Menendez for some time. This was not a spur-of-the-moment decision, nor was it a crime of passion. It was something much darker, a calculated, cold-blooded plot that the brothers believed was their only way out of the suffocating grip of their father's control. In the weeks leading up to that fateful night, the brothers had taken steps that would seal their fate. They had driven to San Diego, a place far enough from home to avoid suspicion, where they purchased 2 Mossberg 12-gauge shotguns. They used fake IDs, a small but significant detail that spoke volumes about their intent. This was no haphazard act of violence. They were meticulous, methodical, and determined to cover their tracks. The brothers conducted dry runs, driving around their neighborhood to pinpoint the best time and method to carry out the killings. They rehearsed the sequence of events in their minds, ensuring that every detail was accounted for. They knew the layout of the house intimately, the habits of their parents, and the weaknesses in the security of their seemingly impenetrable home. They were not just planning a murder, they were planning an escape from a life they could no longer endure. But what could drive 2 young men, raised in wealth and privilege, to such a desperate and violent act? According to their later claims, it was fear. Fear of their father, fear of the abuse they said they had suffered, and fear that their lives were in imminent danger. Whether this fear was real or imagined, it was powerful enough to push them over the edge, to make them believe that murder was their only option. And so, on the night of August 20th, 1989, Lyle and Erik Menendez set their plan into motion, fully aware of the consequences, yet convinced that this was the only way to take back control of their lives. As the clock ticked closer to 10 p.m., the tranquility of the Menendez home was about to be shattered in the most horrific way imaginable. Lyle and Erik returned home, not as sons to their parents, but as executioners, armed with shotguns and a chilling resolve to see their plan through to the end. The first shot rang out with a deafening blast, a sound that would reverberate not just through the house, but through the lives of everyone involved. Lyle pulled the trigger, aiming directly at his father's head. The impact was immediate, the damage catastrophic. Jose Menendez, the man who had controlled every aspect of his sons' lives, was killed instantly, his skull shattered by the force of the blast. The life he had built, brick by brick, was obliterated in an instant. Kitty, jolted awake by the noise, barely had time to react. Disoriented and terrified, she struggled to comprehend the nightmare unfolding before her eyes. But there was no time for understanding, no time for escape. Erik, who had hesitated during the first shot, now stepped forward, his hands trembling as he aimed the shotgun at his mother. The first shot struck her leg, sending her sprawling in agony, but it was not enough to stop her from trying to crawl away, desperate for survival. The brothers pursued her with cold determination, firing again and again, each shot more brutal than the last. Kitty's attempts to escape were futile. The final shot, fired at close range, struck her in the face, obliterating her features and leaving her unrecognizable. In that moment, the woman who had given them life was reduced to a lifeless, bloodied form, a haunting reminder of the violence that had just taken place. 15 shots in total were fired that night, 15 shots that ensured there would be no survivors, no witnesses to tell a different story. The family room, once a place of comfort and security, was now a gruesome crime scene, drenched in blood and scattered with the remains of a life violently extinguished. The brothers, having completed their grim task, stood amidst the carnage, the reality of what they had done sinking in. But there was no time for reflection, no time for remorse. They had to act quickly to set the next phase of their plan into motion. With their parents' lifeless bodies lying in pools of blood, Lyle and Erik Menendez fled the scene, their minds already shifting to the next step in their carefully orchestrated plan. They drove aimlessly through the darkened streets of Beverly Hills, discarding the shotguns along Mulholland Drive, a desolate stretch of road where they hoped the evidence would never be found. But the brothers knew that discarding the murder weapons was not enough. They needed an alibi, something that would place them far from the scene at the time of the murders. And so, in a move as calculated as the murders themselves, they decided to attend a late-night showing of the James Bond film, License to Kill. They purchased tickets, made sure they were seen, and established a timeline that they believed would protect them from suspicion. It was only after they had secured their alibi that Lyle made the now infamous 911 call. His voice, filled with what seemed like genuine panic and grief, echoed through the phone lines. "Somebody killed my parents." The raw emotion in his voice, the frantic urgency of his words convinced the dispatcher, and later the responding officers, that this was a son in shock, devastated by the brutal murder of his parents. When the police arrived at the Menendez mansion, they were greeted by a scene of unimaginable horror. The bodies of Jose and Kitty Menendez lay mutilated in the family room, the sheer brutality of the crime leading investigators to initially believe this was the work of professionals, a mafia-style execution perhaps. The brothers, standing outside the mansion, played their roles to perfection, their grief-stricken faces and uncontrollable sobs adding to the illusion of innocence. Erik, in particular, was almost inconsolable, collapsing onto the lawn as he cried out in despair. To the officers on the scene, it seemed impossible that these two young men, so visibly shattered by the loss of their parents, could be anything other than victims. And for a time, their deception worked. The police, blinded by the apparent grief of the brothers and the gruesome nature of the crime, looked elsewhere for suspects. But as the investigation progressed, the carefully constructed facade began to crack. The Beverly Hills Police Department was no stranger to high-profile cases, but the Menendez murders were different. The sheer brutality of the killings, coupled with the Menendez family's wealth and the gruesome execution-style nature of the crime, left detectives grappling with a multitude of theories. Was this the work of professionals? Had Jose Menendez's business dealings finally caught up with him in the most violent way possible? The initial scene was chaotic, yet curiously, there were details that didn't quite add up. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence that anything of value had been stolen, and nothing that pointed definitively to an external threat. As detectives scoured the Menendez mansion for clues, they found themselves increasingly puzzled by the lack of evidence pointing toward an outsider. This led them to an unsettling possibility. Could the killers have been someone close to the victims, someone who knew them intimately? At first, the Menendez brothers, with their tearful displays of grief, were not considered suspects. They were portrayed in the media as devastated sons who had tragically lost their parents in a horrific attack. Yet, as the investigation deepened, subtle inconsistencies began to emerge, small cracks in the story that raised red flags for the detectives assigned to the case. One of the first things that caught investigators' attention was the brothers' sudden and extravagant spending spree. Within days of their parents' deaths, Lyle and Erik had started to burn through their inheritance with reckless abandon. Lyle bought a Porsche, Erik invested in a tennis coach, and both brothers seemed to be living in a way that starkly contrasted with their supposed grief. This conspicuous consumption didn't sit well with the detectives, who began to question whether the brothers' grief was genuine or merely a facade to cover something far more sinister. The police also began to scrutinize the alibis the brothers had provided. The story of attending a late-night movie seemed plausible at first, but the more they looked into it, the more they realized how perfectly it fit into the timeline of the murders. It was almost too perfect, raising the question, were the Menendez brothers constructing a narrative to protect themselves? As the days turned into weeks, the brothers' behavior became increasingly suspicious. They started to distance themselves from the investigation, showing little interest in helping the police find their parents' killers. Instead of mourning, they appeared to be relishing their newfound freedom and wealth, throwing parties and indulging in luxuries that seemed almost grotesque given the circumstances. Despite their attempts to appear devastated, Lyle and Erik's actions only deepened the detective's suspicions. It was becoming harder to ignore the possibility that the killers were not strangers, but rather the very sons who had claimed to be grieving. As the investigation continued, detectives began to piece together a profile of the Menendez brothers that was starkly different from the public image they had projected. Far from being heartbroken, Lyle and Erik seemed to be enjoying the benefits of their parents' deaths a little too much. This, combined with the evidence, or lack thereof, began to paint a disturbing picture. Investigators dug deeper into the brothers' backgrounds, uncovering a history of strained family dynamics and rebellion. Lyle, in particular, had a reputation for pushing back against his father's strict control, while Erik was known to be more introverted and emotionally vulnerable. Together, they presented a picture of two young men who had long felt oppressed by their father's dominance, potentially harboring deep-seated resentment. The detectives' growing suspicions led them to revisit every detail of the case, particularly the brothers' whereabouts on the night of the murders. They scrutinized the 911 call, analyzing Lyle's tone and choice of words, and replayed Erik's emotional breakdown outside the mansion, looking for any signs of deception. What they found was a series of subtle cues, small inconsistencies and unusual behaviors that, when viewed collectively, began to form a coherent, if chilling, narrative. In the midst of this mounting suspicion, the detectives received a tip that would change the course of the investigation entirely. A woman named Judalyn Smith came forward, claiming that Erik Menendez had confessed to the murders during a therapy session with his psychologist, Dr. Jerome Oziel. Smith, who had been involved with Dr. Oziel, revealed that Erik had detailed the entire plan to kill his parents in those sessions. This revelation was explosive. The confession, if true, was exactly the break the detectives needed to build a case against the brothers. However, it also posed significant legal challenges. The information had been obtained during a therapy session, raising questions about doctor-patient confidentiality, yet the detectives knew they couldn't ignore it. They needed to tread carefully, but they also needed to act fast before the brothers could cover their tracks any further. The investigation was now at a critical juncture. The detectives had moved from suspicion to near certainty, but they needed concrete evidence, something that would hold up in court and ensure that justice was served. The Menendez brothers were no longer just grieving sons, they were now the prime suspects in one of the most brutal family murders in recent history. And so, the net began to close around Lyle and Erik Menendez, as the investigation shifted gears, moving from puzzling out the crime to preparing for an arrest. But even as the detectives prepared to take the brothers into custody, the question remained, could they prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that these two privileged young men had not only committed the unthinkable, but had also managed to deceive everyone around them, at least for a time? The brutal murders of Jose and Kitty Menendez shocked not only the affluent community of Beverly Hills, but also the entire nation. From the moment the bodies were discovered, the investigation was thrust into the spotlight, and the pressure to find those responsible was immense. The Beverly Hills Police Department, tasked with solving this high-profile crime, faced a series of challenges as they attempted to piece together the events of that fateful night. At first, the police considered a wide range of possibilities. The nature of the crime, multiple close-range gunshots, the final shots aimed at obliterating the victims' faces, led investigators to initially theorize that this might have been a professional hit. Jose Menendez was a high-ranking executive in the entertainment industry, and such a position could have potentially exposed him to dangerous elements. The theory of a mafia-style execution was not entirely far-fetched, considering the entertainment industry's historical associations with organized crime. However, as the investigation progressed, the professional hit theory began to lose credibility. There were no signs of forced entry into the Menendez mansion, suggesting that the perpetrators were either known to the victims or had easy access to the house. Additionally, there was no evidence that anything of value had been stolen, further complicating the idea that the murders were motivated by external criminal forces. The crime scene, meticulously combed over by forensic experts, offered little in the way of clues that pointed toward an outside assassin. The police were left with a gruesome murder and few leads. As days turned into weeks, the investigators began to scrutinize the behavior of the Menendez brothers, Lyle and Erik. Initially, they appeared to be devastated by the loss of their parents, their emotional breakdowns during the 911 call, and at the funeral seeming to confirm their status as grieving sons. Yet, the detectives could not ignore certain anomalies in the brothers' behavior. Their sudden and extravagant spending spree raised suspicions. How could two young men, supposedly in mourning, indulge in such ostentatious displays of wealth so soon after their parents' deaths? This inconsistency in their behavior began to attract the attention of the police, who started to view Lyle and Erik not just as victims but as potential suspects. The turning point in the investigation came when Erik Menendez, overcome by guilt and fear, confided in his psychologist, Dr. Jerome Oziel. Erik's decision to reveal the truth about the murders to Dr. Oziel was driven by a complex mix of emotions: remorse for what he had done, fear of getting caught, and perhaps a subconscious desire to unburden himself of the secret that had been weighing on him since that night. The sessions between Erik and Dr. Oziel were initially meant to help Erik cope with his anxiety and emotional turmoil, but they soon became something much more significant. During one of these therapy sessions, Erik broke down and confessed to the murders of his parents. He detailed the events of that night, from the planning stages to the execution, revealing the full extent of his and Lyle's involvement. This confession put Dr. Oziel in an extraordinarily difficult position. As a licensed psychologist, Oziel was bound by the rules of patient confidentiality, which are designed to protect the privacy of the therapeutic relationship. However, these rules are not absolute. The confession of a murder, particularly one as brutal as this, posed a significant ethical dilemma. Dr. Oziel decided to record Erik's confession, a decision that would later become a focal point of the legal battle surrounding the case. Oziel believed that the gravity of the situation justified breaching confidentiality, especially if the information could prevent further harm or bring justice to the victims. However, he did not immediately turn the tapes over to the police. Instead, he kept the recordings, using them as leverage over the Menendez brothers, which only added to the complexity of the case. The confession tapes eventually came to the attention of Oziel's mistress, Judalyn Smith, who, fearing for her own safety, contacted the police and informed them about the recordings. This tip led the investigators to Dr. Oziel, who, under legal pressure, handed over the tapes to the authorities. The content of these tapes would become some of the most crucial pieces of evidence in the prosecution's case against Lyle and Erik Menendez. The introduction of the confession tapes into the legal proceedings sparked intense debate and legal maneuvering. The defense team, led by the formidable Leslie Abramson, immediately challenged the admissibility of the tapes, arguing that they were protected by the doctor-patient privilege. Abramson contended that the tapes were obtained in violation of Erik's rights, and that their use in court would constitute a breach of the confidentiality that is fundamental to the therapeutic relationship. The prosecution, on the other hand, argued that the tapes were essential evidence in a murder case and should be admitted. They contended that the gravity of the crime outweighed the protections typically afforded by doctor-patient privilege. The legal battle over the tapes was fierce, with both sides presenting compelling arguments. The case eventually reached the California Supreme Court, which ruled that while the tapes were obtained under questionable circumstances, their importance to the case meant they could be used as evidence. This ruling was a significant victory for the prosecution, but it also raised broader questions about the limits of confidentiality in therapy and the responsibilities of mental health professionals when they are made aware of serious crimes. The case set a precedent in California law, with implications for how future cases involving similar circumstances would be handled. The decision also underscored the ethical complexities that arise when the legal system intersects with mental health care, particularly in cases involving violent crime. Armed with the confession tapes and mounting circumstantial evidence, the Beverly Hills Police Department moved to arrest Lyle and Erik Menendez. The arrests marked the beginning of one of the most sensational legal battles of the late 20th century, a case that would captivate the nation and spark debates about wealth, privilege, and justice. Lyle Menendez was the first to be arrested. On March 8, 1990, police officers apprehended him outside the family's Beverly Hills mansion. The arrest was a dramatic moment, one that signaled a significant shift in the case. Lyle, who had been living the high life following the murders, was now in handcuffs, his future uncertain. His arrest sent shockwaves through the community, which had largely viewed the brothers as tragic victims rather than suspects. Erik Menendez was not in the United States at the time of Lyle's arrest. He was in Israel, participating in a tennis tournament, a sport at which he excelled and which had provided him with a sense of identity separate from the pressures of his family. When Erik learned of his brother's arrest, he made the decision to return to the United States and surrender to the authorities. On March 11, 1990, just 3 days after Lyle's arrest, Erik was taken into custody at Los Angeles International Airport. His surrender was less dramatic than Lyle's arrest, but it was equally significant, marking the culmination of the investigation and setting the stage for the legal battles to come. The arrests of Lyle and Erik Menendez were met with a mix of shock and skepticism by the public. Many people found it hard to believe that these two young men, who had been seen as victims, could be capable of such a brutal crime. The case quickly became a media sensation, with news outlets across the country covering every development. The image of the Menendez brothers, once the privileged sons of a successful businessman, now stood in stark contrast to the reality of their situation. They were accused of murdering their parents in cold blood. The courtroom was more than just a battleground, it was a stage, and the Menendez brothers found themselves at the center of a drama that would grip the nation. The first trial of Lyle and Erik Menendez stands as one of the most high-profile and complex cases in American legal history. From the moment the trial began on July 20, 1993, in the Los Angeles County Superior Court, it was clear that this was not just a legal proceeding but a cultural phenomenon that would challenge the American justice system and the nation's perception of crime and punishment. Presiding over the trial was Judge Stanley Weisberg, a man known for his stern demeanor and commitment to maintaining order in his courtroom. But no amount of judicial authority could entirely quell the tension that crackled in the air. The courtroom was packed with attorneys, family members, journalists, and a parade of witnesses, all under the watchful eyes of millions of viewers who followed the trial on television. This was one of the first major criminal cases to be broadcast live on court TV, bringing the intricacies of the legal process into living rooms across the country and turning the trial into a national obsession. Key players emerged on both sides of the courtroom. For the prosecution, Deputy District Attorney Pamela Bozanich was tasked with proving that Lyle and Erik had murdered their parents out of greed and a desire for control. Bozanich, known for her methodical approach and steely demeanor, sought to present the brothers as calculating killers who had plotted their parents' deaths to inherit the family fortune. On the defense side, Leslie Abramson became the face of the Menendez brothers' legal battle. Abramson, a highly skilled and passionate attorney, was known for her fierce advocacy and her ability to humanize her clients. She would argue that Lyle and Erik were not motivated by greed, but by fear of their father, who she claimed had sexually and psychologically abused them for years. Abramson's strategy was to shift the focus away from the cold facts of the murders and toward the emotional and psychological turmoil that had allegedly driven the brothers to commit such a heinous act. The trial also featured a parade of expert witnesses, psychologists, and family members, all of whom contributed to the complex narrative that would unfold over the coming months. The brothers themselves were central figures in the trial, both as defendants and as witnesses who would take the stand to tell their side of the story. Their testimony would be pivotal, as it was their only chance to explain their actions to the jury and the world. The prosecution's case against Lyle and Erik Menendez was built on a chilling premise that the murders were premeditated acts of greed, committed by two young men who wanted to free themselves from their father's control and gain access to the family's considerable wealth. Deputy District Attorney Pamela Bozanich set out to prove that the brothers had meticulously planned the killings, purchasing the shotguns used in the murders days before the crime and executing their parents in a manner that suggested cold calculation rather than a spontaneous act of desperation. One of the key pieces of evidence presented by the prosecution was the shotgun shells and wadding found at the crime scene. Forensic experts testified that these matched the shotguns that the brothers had purchased in San Diego just days before the murders. The prosecution argued that this purchase, made under false names and far from their home, indicated premeditation and an attempt to cover their tracks. In addition to the forensic evidence, the prosecution placed significant emphasis on the brothers' behavior in the days and weeks following the murders. Bosnich highlighted the fact that Lyle and Erik went on a spending spree, purchasing luxury cars, Rolex watches, and even a restaurant. This behavior, she argued, was not consistent with that of grieving sons, but rather suggested that the brothers had been motivated by a desire to enjoy their newfound wealth. Perhaps the most damning evidence presented by the prosecution was the tapes recorded by Dr. Jerome Oziel, the brothers' psychologist. These tapes captured confessions from Erik, who had told Dr. Oziel that he and Lyle had killed their parents. The prosecution fought hard to have these tapes admitted as evidence, arguing that they were crucial to establishing the brothers' guilt. Despite the defense's objections, the judge ruled that the tapes could be used in court, providing the prosecution with a direct link between the brothers and the crime. Throughout the trial, the prosecution sought to undermine the defense's narrative of abuse, arguing that the allegations of sexual and psychological torment were fabricated or exaggerated. Bosnich pointed out that the allegations of abuse had only surfaced after the brothers were arrested and charged with murder, suggesting that the claims were a convenient excuse rather than a genuine reflection of their experiences. The prosecution's strategy was clear: to present the Menendez brothers as manipulative and greedy, willing to kill their parents in cold blood to escape their father's control and gain access to their inheritance. The evidence was strong, and Bosnich's presentation was meticulous, but the defense had a very different story to tell. Leslie Abramson's defense strategy was nothing short of revolutionary. Instead of denying that Lyle and Erik Menendez had killed their parents, she focused on explaining why they had done so. According to Abramson, the brothers were victims, not perpetrators, victims of a lifetime of abuse that had culminated in an act of desperate self-defense. Abramson argued that Jose Menendez was a tyrannical and abusive father who had subjected his sons to years of sexual, physical, and psychological torment. This abuse, she claimed, had left the brothers deeply traumatized and fearful for their lives. Abramson's defense was rooted in the concept of battered child syndrome, a psychological condition in which prolonged abuse leads to a state of chronic fear and helplessness. According to the defense, Lyle and Erik believed that their father was planning to kill them to prevent the abuse from being exposed, and they felt that they had no other choice but to kill him first. To support this narrative, Abramson called several witnesses who testified about the dysfunctional nature of the Menendez household. These included family members, friends, and former employees, all of whom described Jose as a controlling and abusive figure. The defense also called expert witnesses, including psychologists and child abuse specialists, who testified about the long-term effects of sexual abuse and the psychological impact it can have on its victims. The most dramatic moment of the trial came when Lyle and Erik themselves took the stand to testify about the abuse they had suffered. Their testimonies were graphic and emotional, describing in detail the sexual and physical abuse they claimed to have endured at the hands of their father. Lyle spoke of being molested by Jose from a young age, while Erik described how he had been forced to perform sexual acts on his father. Their accounts were harrowing, and they painted a picture of a family life that was filled with fear, shame, and violence. Abramson's strategy was to humanize the brothers, to present them not as ruthless killers, but as damaged young men who had been driven to the brink by years of abuse. She argued that the murders were not premeditated acts of greed, but rather a tragic response to the unbearable psychological pressure they had been under. The defense's narrative was compelling, and it resonated with some members of the jury, but it also faced significant challenges. The prosecution countered by questioning the timing of the brothers' revelations, pointing out that the allegations of abuse had only surfaced after they were arrested. Bosnich also highlighted inconsistencies in the brothers' stories and suggested that the abuse allegations were a calculated attempt to avoid responsibility for their crimes. Despite these challenges, Abramson's defense made a powerful impact. The jury was faced with the difficult task of deciding whether the brothers' actions were motivated by genuine fear and desperation, or whether they were simply using the abuse narrative as a convenient excuse. The trial was far from straightforward, and the emotional weight of the testimonies complicated the jury's deliberations. After the first trial ended in a mistrial, with juries deadlocked on whether Lyle and Erik Menendez had committed first-degree murder or acted out of fear induced by years of alleged abuse, the prosecution was determined to secure a conviction in the retrials. These subsequent trials were not just a repeat of the first, they represented a more calculated, strategic effort by both the prosecution and the defense, with each side refining its approach in light of the previous trial's outcomes. The Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office, led by the determined Deputy District Attorney David Kahn, took a hard look at what had gone wrong in the first trial. The prosecution's revamped strategy focused on three main pillars: separating the trials of the two brothers, minimizing the impact of the abuse claims, and reinforcing the evidence of premeditation. One of the most critical decisions made by the prosecution was to separate the trials of Lyle and Erik Menendez. In the first trial, the brothers had been tried together, which allowed the defense to present a unified front, with both brothers supporting each other's accounts of the alleged abuse. The prosecution recognized that this dynamic had strengthened the defense's narrative, making it more challenging to secure a conviction. By separating the trials, the prosecution aimed to weaken the defense's ability to present a cohesive story, forcing each brother to stand alone without the immediate support of the other. This strategic move was designed to isolate each brother, making their stories more vulnerable to scrutiny and reducing the emotional impact of their joint defense. The decision to separate the trials also allowed the prosecution to tailor its case against each brother individually, focusing on their specific actions and behaviors before and after the murders. The defense's claims of long-term sexual and psychological abuse had played a significant role in the first trial, contributing to the jury's inability to reach a unanimous verdict. In the retrials, the prosecution sought to downplay these allegations, arguing that even if the abuse had occurred, it did not justify the premeditated nature of the murders. The prosecution's strategy was to shift the focus away from the alleged abuse and back onto the facts of the crime. They emphasized that the brothers had planned the murders well in advance, purchasing shotguns days before the killings and taking steps to cover their tracks. The prosecution argued that this level of premeditation was inconsistent with a crime of passion or one driven by fear. They contended that the brothers' actions were motivated not by a genuine belief that their lives were in danger, but by a desire to gain control of their parents' wealth and escape their father's strict control. To bolster this narrative, the prosecution highlighted the brothers' behavior in the weeks following the murders. They presented evidence of the lavish spending spree that Lyle and Erik embarked upon, which included the purchase of luxury cars, expensive clothing, and even a restaurant. This behavior, they argued, was inconsistent with the actions of individuals who had killed out of fear or desperation. Instead, it suggested a calculated effort to enjoy the benefits of their parents' estate. The prosecution also focused heavily on the forensic evidence, which they argued clearly pointed to premeditation. Ballistics experts testified that the shotguns used in the murders were purchased by the brothers, using fake names and traveling to a different city to avoid detection. The autopsy reports were used to emphasize the brutal nature of the crime, with multiple shots fired at close range, including shots to the head, which suggested an execution-style killing. In their closing arguments, the prosecution sought to remind the jury of the gravity of the crime. They presented the murders as a cold, calculated act carried out by two young men who were fully aware of what they were doing. The prosecution urged the jury to see through the defense's narrative of abuse and to focus on the overwhelming evidence of premeditation and intent. Leslie Abramson and the defense team faced an uphill battle in the retrials. The decision to separate the trials of Lyle and Erik Menendez posed a significant challenge, as it limited the defense's ability to present a unified narrative of abuse. Despite these challenges, Abramson remained committed to her core argument that the brothers had been driven to murder by years of sexual and psychological abuse at the hands of their father. The defense's primary argument in both retrials was that Lyle and Erik Menendez had suffered years of sexual and psychological abuse at the hands of their father, Jose Menendez. According to the defense, this abuse had created a deep-seated fear and anger within the brothers, which eventually erupted into violence. Abramson argued that the brothers genuinely believed they were in imminent danger of being killed by their parents to prevent the abuse from being exposed. To support these claims, the defense called several expert witnesses who testified about the long-term effects of sexual and psychological abuse. These experts explained how prolonged abuse could lead to a distorted sense of reality, in which the brothers might have believed that their only escape was to kill their parents. The defense also presented evidence of the Menendez family's dysfunctional dynamics, including testimony from relatives and family friends who spoke about the volatile relationship between Jose and Kitty and their sons. Both Lyle and Erik Menendez took the stand once again, recounting in graphic detail the abuse they had allegedly suffered. Their testimonies were emotional and intense, with both brothers describing years of torment that had left them feeling trapped and hopeless. The defense aimed to evoke sympathy from the jury, portraying the brothers as victims who had been driven to commit a terrible act by forces beyond their control. In addition to recounting the abuse, the defense sought to emphasize the psychological impact of that abuse on Lyle and Erik. The defense argued that the brothers had developed severe psychological issues as a result of the abuse, including complex post-traumatic stress disorder, CPTSD, and battered child syndrome. These conditions, they claimed, had warped the brothers' perception of reality and led them to believe that their lives were in imminent danger. The defense called upon psychologists and mental health experts to testify about the effects of long-term abuse on children and adolescents. These experts explained how the brothers' experiences of abuse could have led to a state of learned helplessness, where they felt powerless to escape their situation. The defense argued that this psychological state was a key factor in the brothers' decision to kill their parents, as they believed there was no other way to end the abuse. The separation of the trials posed significant challenges for the defense. In the first trial, the brothers had been able to support each other's testimonies, presenting a united front that reinforced the narrative of abuse. However, in the retrials, each brother had to testify without the immediate support of the other, which made their accounts more vulnerable to scrutiny. The defense also faced the challenge of countering the prosecution's focus on premeditation. The prosecution argued that the brothers had planned the murders well in advance, purchasing the shotguns and taking steps to cover their tracks. The defense sought to undermine this narrative by emphasizing the psychological turmoil the brothers were experiencing at the time of the murders, arguing that their actions were not the result of a cold, calculated plan, but rather a desperate attempt to escape their father's control. Despite these challenges, the defense remained committed to its core argument. They argued that the brothers' actions, while tragic, were the result of a lifetime of abuse and psychological trauma. The defense urged the jury to consider the broader context of the brothers' lives and to recognize that the murders were not motivated by greed or malice, but by a genuine fear for their lives. The retrials of Lyle and Erik Menendez took place against a backdrop of intense media scrutiny and evolving public opinion. The first trial had captivated the nation, with millions of viewers tuning in to watch the proceedings on television. The retrials, while still closely followed, saw a shift in public perception, as the initial shock and sympathy for the brothers gave way to growing skepticism about their claims of abuse. In the first trial, the Menendez brothers had garnered a significant amount of public sympathy, particularly after they took the stand to describe the abuse they had allegedly suffered at the hands of their father. Many viewers were moved by their emotional testimonies and began to view them as victims who had been driven to commit a terrible act out of desperation. However, as the retrials unfolded, public opinion began to shift. The decision to separate the trials and the prosecution's emphasis on premeditation and forensic evidence led many to question the validity of the brothers' abuse claims. The lavish spending spree that followed the murders, which had been downplayed in the first trial, was now seen by many as evidence of the brothers' true motives. The media coverage of the retrials also played a role in shaping public perception. While the first trial had been a sensational spectacle, the retrials were covered with a more critical eye, with many commentators questioning the defense's narrative and suggesting that the brothers were using the abuse allegations as a convenient excuse to avoid responsibility for their actions. As the retrials progressed, skepticism toward the defense's narrative grew. Many observers began to see the brothers' claims of abuse as a strategic move designed to elicit sympathy from the jury and avoid a conviction for first-degree murder. The separation of the trials also made it more difficult for the defense to present a cohesive story, as each brother's testimony was now more isolated and subject to greater scrutiny. The prosecution's focus on the evidence of premeditation, combined with the brothers' behavior after the murders, led many to believe that the killings were motivated by greed rather than fear. The public began to see the Menendez brothers not as tragic figures, but as cold-blooded killers who had meticulously planned the murders to gain control of their parents' wealth. This shift in public perception was reflected in the media coverage of the retrials, which increasingly portrayed the brothers as manipulative and untrustworthy. Commentators pointed to the inconsistencies in their testimonies and questioned whether the abuse claims were genuine or simply a convenient defense strategy. The retrials of Lyle and Erik Menendez culminated in a dramatic conclusion that would determine their fate. After months of testimony, legal arguments, and intense media coverage, the juries in both cases reached their verdicts. The final outcome of the retrials would not only bring closure to the legal proceedings, but also spark widespread debate about the justice system, the role of abuse as a defense, and the influence of wealth and privilege in criminal cases. In 1996, after a grueling series of retrials, the juries in both cases found Lyle and Erik Menendez guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. The verdicts marked a significant victory for the prosecution, which had worked tirelessly to counter the defense's narrative of abuse and to emphasize the premeditated nature of the crime. The juries rejected the defense's argument that the brothers had acted out of fear for their lives, concluding instead that the murders were premeditated and driven by a desire for financial gain. The evidence of premeditation, including the purchase of the shotguns, the efforts to cover their tracks, and the lavish spending spree that followed the murders, was seen as overwhelming and conclusive. The guilty verdicts brought a sense of closure to the case, but they also left many questions unanswered. For some, the verdicts were a clear affirmation that justice had been served, that the Menendez brothers had committed a heinous crime and were rightly punished. For others, the verdicts were a reflection of a flawed legal system that had failed to fully consider the impact of the alleged abuse. Following the guilty verdicts, the sentencing phase of the trial began. The prosecution sought the death penalty, arguing that the brutal nature of the crime warranted the most severe punishment. However, the defense argued that the brothers' traumatic upbringing should be considered as a mitigating factor and that they should be spared the death penalty. After much deliberation, the jury sentenced Lyle and Erik Menendez to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The decision to impose life sentences rather than the death penalty was seen as a compromise, reflecting the jury's acknowledgement of the brothers' troubled past while also holding them accountable for their actions. The life sentences brought an end to the legal proceedings, but the case continued to resonate in the public consciousness. The Menendez brothers were sent to separate maximum security prisons to serve their sentences, where they would remain for the rest of their lives. The Menendez case did more than captivate the public, it left an indelible mark on the American legal system. The case tested the boundaries of several legal principles, setting precedents that would influence future criminal trials, particularly those involving claims of abuse and the admissibility of certain types of evidence. One of the most significant legal implications of the Menendez case was the precedent it set regarding the use of abuse as a defense in criminal trials. Leslie Abramson's defense strategy, which centered around allegations of long-term sexual and psychological abuse, challenged the jury to consider the psychological effects of such trauma on the Menendez brothers' actions. While the defense did not result in an acquittal, it did lead to a hung jury in the first trial, highlighting the power of psychological trauma as a mitigating factor in criminal cases. This raised important questions about the extent to which past abuse can be used to justify violent actions and the degree to which the legal system should consider the psychological state of defendants in determining guilt or innocence. The case sparked a broader legal debate about the limits of such defenses. In the years following the Menendez trial, courts and legal scholars have grappled with the complex interplay between psychological trauma and criminal responsibility. The case contributed to a growing recognition of the impact of trauma on behavior, which has influenced how courts approach cases involving similar claims of abuse. Another critical legal issue raised by the Menendez case was the admissibility of evidence obtained through the breach of doctor-patient confidentiality. The tapes recorded by Dr. Jerome Oziel, in which Erik Menendez confessed to the murders during a therapy session, became a focal point of the legal battles. The decision to admit these tapes into evidence, despite the defense's arguments about the sanctity of doctor-patient privilege, set a significant precedent. The court's ruling on this matter underscored the idea that confidentiality in therapy has limits, particularly when it involves admissions of serious crimes. This decision has had lasting implications for how courts handle similar cases, influencing the balance between protecting patient confidentiality and ensuring that justice is served. The Menendez case also reinforced the importance of forensic evidence in securing convictions. The prosecution's ability to link the shotguns used in the murders to the brothers through ballistic analysis was crucial in proving premeditation. The meticulous presentation of forensic evidence demonstrated the critical role that scientific analysis plays in modern criminal trials, and the case has been cited in discussions about the necessity of maintaining rigorous standards in forensic investigations. The Menendez brothers' trial was more than a legal proceeding, it was a media spectacle that captivated the nation and helped to shape the true crime genre as we know it today. The live broadcast of the Menendez trials on Court TV marked a significant moment in the history of media coverage of criminal trials. It brought the drama of the courtroom into millions of homes, turning legal proceedings into a form of entertainment. This unprecedented access allowed the public to witness the complexities of the legal process, but it also raised questions about the influence of media on justice. The Menendez case played a crucial role in the rise of the true crime genre, paving the way for countless documentaries, television series, and podcasts that explore criminal cases in depth. The case's blend of wealth, privilege, family drama, and brutal crime made it a compelling story, and it has been revisited in numerous media formats over the years. This fascination with the Menendez case reflects a broader cultural obsession with understanding the dark side of human nature, particularly when it manifests in such shocking ways. The case also highlighted the potential risks of televising trials. The intense media coverage created a circus-like atmosphere that some critics argued could influence the jury and potentially undermine the fairness of the proceedings. The Menendez case set a precedent for how media interacts with the legal system, a trend that has continued in other high-profile cases, such as those of O.J. Simpson and Casey Anthony. More than 3 decades after the murders, the Menendez brothers remain figures of enduring interest in popular culture. Their story has been the subject of numerous documentaries and dramatizations, including the television series Law and Order: True Crime, The Menendez Murders, which revisited the case with a modern perspective. This ongoing fascination is indicative of a deep-seated interest in true crime stories that delve into the psychological motivations behind heinous acts. The Menendez brothers' case, with its mix of familial betrayal, wealth, and extreme violence, continues to captivate audiences who are drawn to the complexities of human behavior. The Menendez brothers themselves have also become symbolic figures in discussions about the intersections of privilege, trauma, and justice. Their case is often referenced in broader cultural debates about the legal system, the media's role in shaping public perception, and the moral ambiguities that arise in cases of extreme violence. The Menendez case has had a significant impact on discussions about trauma, mental illness, and criminal behavior, as well as on broader sociological debates about personal responsibility and the limits of abuse defenses. The allegations of long-term abuse made by Lyle and Erik Menendez brought important issues to the forefront of public discourse. The defense's portrayal of the brothers as victims of severe psychological and sexual abuse by their father forced society to confront the profound impact that such trauma can have on an individual's behavior. The case highlighted the concept of battered child syndrome, a psychological condition in which prolonged abuse leads to a state of chronic fear and helplessness. The Menendez case has been used as a reference point in discussions about how severe trauma can distort an individual's perception of reality, potentially leading to extreme actions, including violence. This case also raised questions about the role of mental illness in criminal behavior. The defense's arguments focused on how the brothers' psychological state, shaped by years of abuse, contributed to their decision to murder their parents. This narrative has influenced how courts and mental health professionals approach cases where psychological trauma is a factor, contributing to a deeper understanding of the relationship between trauma and criminal actions. The Menendez case also sparked broader debates about personal responsibility and the limits of abuse defenses. While the defense argued that the brothers' actions were a direct result of the abuse they had suffered, the prosecution and many in the public viewed this as an attempt to evade responsibility for a premeditated crime. This tension between acknowledging the psychological impact of abuse and holding individuals accountable for their actions remains a central issue in legal and ethical discussions. The Menendez case challenged the legal system to consider where the line should be drawn between understanding and excusing criminal behavior. The case also contributed to ongoing discussions about the role of personal responsibility in the justice system. How should the courts balance empathy for those who have suffered trauma with the need to ensure that justice is served for victims of crime? The Menendez case continues to serve as a focal point for these important questions, influencing how similar cases are approached in the future. Despite the final verdict and the passage of time, the Menendez case continues to provoke questions that challenge our understanding of justice, family dynamics, and the influence of privilege. One of the most enduring aspects of the Menendez case is the tension between viewing Lyle and Erik as victims of their father's abuse versus seeing them as perpetrators of a brutal double murder. This duality has fueled ongoing debates about the nature of justice and the extent to which past trauma should influence our judgment of criminal actions. For some, the Menendez brothers are tragic figures who were driven to commit an unthinkable act by years of suffering at the hands of their father. These supporters argue that the abuse they endured should be taken into account when considering their actions, and that their life sentences are an unjust reflection of a legal system that failed to fully understand the psychological impact of such trauma. For others, the brothers are cold-blooded killers who exploited allegations of abuse to evade responsibility for their actions. These critics point to the evidence of premeditation, the brothers' behavior after the murders, and their apparent lack of remorse as indicators that they should be held fully accountable for their crimes. This tension reflects broader societal questions about how we define justice and the factors that should be considered in determining guilt and punishment. The case remains a powerful example of the challenges involved in balancing empathy with accountability in the pursuit of justice. The Menendez case has also prompted broader reflections on the nature of justice, the dynamics within families, and the role of privilege in the legal system. The case highlights how power and control within families can lead to tragic outcomes and raises important questions about the responsibilities of parents and the impact of family dynamics on children's development. The case also underscores the influence of privilege in the justice system. The Menendez brothers' ability to afford a high-powered defense team, which some argue played a role in the initial mistrial and the lengthy legal battles that followed, has fueled ongoing debates about disparities in the criminal justice system. How does wealth and social status affect the outcome of trials? What role does the media play in shaping public perception of justice, and how does this influence the legal process? These broader societal reflections continue to be relevant as we consider the implications of the Menendez case for contemporary issues of justice, family dynamics, and privilege. The case serves as a reminder of the complexities involved in addressing these issues and the need for a legal system that is both fair and responsive to the nuances of human behavior. The Menendez case, with its complex web of family dynamics, legal battles, and media spectacle, stands as one of the most significant and controversial criminal cases in American history. It not only captivated the nation but also left an enduring legacy that continues to influence discussions about justice, privilege, and the human psyche. At its core, the Menendez case is a stark reminder that wealth and privilege do not insulate individuals from the darker aspects of human nature. The Menendez family, who seemed to epitomize the American dream, harbored deep-seated dysfunction that ultimately led to one of the most shocking family murders in modern history. The case highlighted how privilege can complicate the pursuit of justice, particularly when resources allow for a robust legal defense that can shape the narrative and influence public perception. The case also brought to light the destructive potential of toxic family dynamics. Jose Menendez's authoritarian control and the alleged long-term abuse of his sons created an environment of fear and resentment that eventually culminated in violence. The Menendez brothers' actions, while criminal, were deeply rooted in the psychological scars inflicted by their upbringing. This case forces us to confront the reality that even within seemingly perfect families, unaddressed trauma can fester, leading to tragic consequences. The Menendez trial was one of the first to be broadcast live, turning the courtroom into a stage and the participants into characters in a real-life drama. The media's role in the trial underscored the power of storytelling in shaping public opinion and highlighted the ethical challenges of televising trials. The case set the stage for the true crime genre that would explode in popularity in the following decades, showing how criminal cases can transcend the legal realm to become cultural phenomena. Legally, the Menendez case set significant precedents, particularly regarding the use of abuse as a defense and the admissibility of confidential therapy records in court. The case pushed the boundaries of how the legal system views psychological trauma in relation to criminal behavior, influencing future cases and contributing to the evolving discourse on criminal responsibility. It also emphasized the critical role of forensic evidence in securing convictions, reinforcing the need for meticulous scientific investigation in criminal cases. From a psychological perspective, the case contributed to a deeper understanding of how trauma and abuse can impact behavior, particularly in cases of extreme violence. The defense's argument that the brothers were driven to murder by years of abuse highlighted the complex relationship between past trauma and criminal actions. The case has been used as a reference in discussions about battered child syndrome and the long-term effects of psychological and sexual abuse, contributing to a broader understanding of these issues in both the legal and psychological fields. As we conclude our exploration of the Menendez case, it's clear that this story is far more than just a true crime tale. It's a powerful reflection on the human condition. The case forces us to grapple with some of the most challenging questions about justice, morality, and the lasting impact of trauma. The Menendez brothers' actions, whether seen as the desperate acts of abused children or the calculated moves of cold-blooded killers, serve as a reminder of the complexities involved in understanding criminal behavior. Their case challenges us to think critically about the intersection of privilege, power, and violence, and about how our society addresses these issues in the pursuit of justice. The legacy of the Menendez case is one of ongoing debate and reflection. It continues to provoke questions about the fairness of our legal system, the influence of media on justice, and the psychological toll of familial abuse. As society evolves, so too does our interpretation of the Menendez case, ensuring that it remains a relevant and poignant topic of discussion. As we bring this journey to a close, we are left with the understanding that the Menendez case is not just a story from the past, but a living narrative that continues to shape our collective consciousness. It serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power and the devastating effects of unresolved trauma. But it also challenges us to reflect on the nature of justice and the complexities of human behavior, leaving us with more questions than answers. Thank you so much for listening all the way through. If you've made it to this point, drop a comment with the word "done," and we'll give you a personal shout-out to show our appreciation. We hope you enjoyed this deep dive into the Menendez brothers' case, a story of abuse, murder, and media frenzy. It was as fascinating for us to create as we hope it was for you to hear. If you found this episode thought-provoking, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. We also invite you to join our YouTube channel, where we can answer your questions directly and share exclusive members-only content. We'd love to know what you think about this case. Was justice truly served? Share your opinions in the comments below. We're always eager to hear your thoughts. For those wanting to explore the case further, we've included an Amazon affiliate link to some of the books we referenced in our research. Purchasing through the link won't cost you anything extra, but it will support the channel and help us continue bringing you more content. If you're craving even more, consider joining our Patreon community. As a member, you'll get access to the full script of this episode, exclusive book summaries, and even the complete set of images featured in this case, available for purchase in our Patreon store. This has been 22 Crime. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay safe.